The Japanese word Nintendo is said to loosely translate to leave luck to heaven in English, but that's exactly what the company didn't do with their successful home consoles. Well, other than the Wii U. Nintendo made their own luck and became one of the greatest video game companies in the world, but it wasn't always easy. Making controllers has never been the company's strong suit, but one thing they've consistently done is innovate. Nintendo is always pushing innovation, and that is evident through their controllers. So let's take a look at the evolution of Nintendo controllers from the NES all the way to the Nintendo Switch. Believe it or not, Nintendo was founded in 1889 as a trading card company. It took until the late 70s for them to release their first video game console. That's right, before there was the Nintendo Entertainment System, there was the Color TV Game 6. Released solely in Japan in 1977, it was Nintendo's first foray into the gaming world, and had the highest sales out of any first-generation gaming console, setting the stage for the NES. Released in Japan in 1983 and North America 2 years later in 1985, the NES is the console that truly began the gaming craze. Not only was it an unbelievable 8-bit console at the time, but its controller set the standard that was to come in console gaming. Before the NES controller, most controllers were similar to what we saw in arcades, like the Atari 2600 and its joystick with a single button. But Nintendo went in a completely different direction. Literally, they introduced a directional pad instead of a huge joystick. Nowadays, it's hilarious to think of playing games using just the D-pad, but most games at this time were side-scrollers that didn't need perfect directional input, so a D-pad was perfectly fine. Other than the D-pad, the NES controller only had 4 other buttons: A, B, Start, and Select, which made it perfect for gamers just taking their first steps into the console world. 8-bit games weren't nearly as complicated as today's games, so you didn't need that many buttons. The NES controller was the best in the business back in the day, but we wished it had a longer cord. The next decade saw the release of the 16-bit Super NES in Japan in 1990 and North America in 1991. Despite some stiff competition from the Sega Genesis, Nintendo stayed on top of the console wars with the SNES. It may not have sold as well as the NES, but we have so many fond memories of this console, especially the controller. The SNES controller took everything the NES controller got right and improved on it. The controller became more rounded and comfortable to hold, which was really the only negative about the NES controller. The SNES controller was even much more colorful than the NES controller, well, if you have the European version, that is. The controller also introduced 4 new buttons: X, Y, L, and R. That's right, we finally got shoulder buttons. While it looks simple compared to the controllers of today, it was way ahead of its time and allowed for so much more functionality. As the tech behind video games advanced, so did the controllers. And the SNES controller was arguably one of the greatest controllers of all time. The only setback was once again that incredibly short cord that forced you to stay close to the TV. 1996 saw the release of the Nintendo 64, a console that finally allowed us to play 3D platformers. Because of the push for 3D graphics and gameplay at the time, analog sticks were a must, and one was front and center on the N64 controller, a controller that still divides gamers to this day. It's not a bad controller by any means, it was just very unique when compared to the PlayStation controller, which made it quite awkward to hold. The M-shaped design of the controller with the analog stick in the middle certainly made a statement though. It actually looked really good at the time. The controller got rid of the X, Y, and Select buttons and added directional C buttons and a Z button on the back. We're not a fan of buttons being placed behind controllers, but all of these additions allowed us to do even more in games. We were able to move around in 3D space efficiently, and the controller was sturdy enough to hold up over the years. There was a slot in the back for a rumble or memory pack, but it was an extra expense and not all games utilized the features. The Legend of Zelda Ocarina of Time, for example, had a save function built into the cartridge, so no memory card was needed. All in all, despite its lackluster design, it did quite a few things right and really set the stage for the next controller Nintendo would make. In 2001, the Nintendo GameCube was released, and honestly, it wasn't a very big hit. Only 21.75 million GameCubes were sold worldwide, which was dwarfed by the PlayStation 2's 155 million. After all, it is the best-selling console of all time. Like the NES and SNES controllers, the GameCube controller is arguably one of the best controllers of all time, and many gamers believe it was Nintendo's best controller. They got rid of the Z button on the back and moved it to the shoulder of the controller, right in the front of the R button. We also saw the analog stick move to the more traditional top left corner, and the directional C buttons were replaced with an analog C stick. So all the buttons are still there from the N64, they're just in better spots and modernized. If you think about it, the GameCube controller was sort of like a perfected version of the N64 controller. Like all of Nintendo's controllers before it, the GameCube controller was wired, but there was a wireless variant called the Wavebird. It had an adapter that plugged into the controller port of the console, so it could transmit radio waves to the controller. It was much less reliable than Bluetooth, but at the time in 2003, an official wireless controller was unheard of. 2 decades later, players are still using the GameCube controller on their Switch, mainly to play Super Smash Bros. Since it's widely regarded as the best Smash controller around. The fact that it's still popular today is a testament to how amazing the GameCube controller really was. But things changed in 2006 with the release of the Wii. The Wii Remote was a step in a completely different direction by Nintendo, and there's more to it than the fact that it was called a remote and not a controller. While the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360 were focusing on processing power and graphics back then, Nintendo went in a different direction with the Wii, and focused on motion control gaming. A lot of gamers thought Nintendo lost their minds with the Wii Remote, but after the muted success of the GameCube, Nintendo was forced to rethink themselves, and the rise of the Wii really set the company apart. We even thought motion controls were a gimmick at first, but quickly changed our tune. The Wiimote had a completely new look. A lot of the buttons we came to know and love from previous consoles were removed and replaced with oddly named buttons. We now had a home button, as well as a plus and minus and 1 and 2 buttons. It was nothing like what we saw on the PS3 and Xbox 360 at the time. There were many more unique features of the Wiimote though. Of course, there was a sensor on top of the controller to detect movement. Some games even required a nunchuck that could be plugged into the bottom of the Wiimote. It would essentially add an analog stick and C and Z buttons, as well as another motion sensor for games requiring 2 hands, like boxing and Wii Sports. The Wiimote had a ton of potential, and Nintendo absolutely reached it on the Wii as it sold over 100 million units worldwide. So the Wii was a smashing success for Nintendo, but what goes up must come down. The Wii U was released in 2012 and was Nintendo's biggest flop of a console not called the Virtual Boy, partly because of its controller, the gamepad. The marketing campaign for the Wii U made it seem like the gamepad was simply an add-on for the Wii, but it turns out that the Wii U was its very own console that came with a gamepad. It was a chunky controller that worked fairly well, but it took away what made the Wii so great since it restricted movement. You couldn't hold the gamepad in one hand and swing it around like a tennis racket. Heck, you had to be within 27.5 feet of the Wii U for it to even work. The Wii gave us the freedom of movement, and the Wii U took it away. As for what we got in the gamepad, it was a return to a more traditional controller. It featured 2 analog sticks, a D-pad, a home button, A, B, X, and Y buttons, as well as start, select, and even shoulder buttons. Other than the built-in screen, there was nothing that really made the gamepad stand out. Essentially, it was the bottom screen of a DS, and the TV was the top screen. It was nothing we didn't already experience before. Nintendo later came out with a Wii U Pro controller, and this thing was also quite unique. Both analog sticks were at the top of the controller as opposed to being offset like the Xbox or both on the bottom like the PlayStation. While it was very unusual, it didn't take long to get used to. It was a solid controller, but it wasn't compatible with Wii games, and the power and home buttons were just a little too close together for our liking. Looking back, it seems like the Wii U was simply just a prototype for what was to come, the Nintendo Switch. Released in 2017, the Nintendo Switch is arguably Nintendo's most innovative console yet. It's everything that the Wii U wished it was, the first true hybrid console. Of course, with a hybrid console, you're also going to need hybrid controllers. And that is exactly what the JoyCons are. The JoyCons are some of the best controllers Nintendo has ever produced. Sure, they're quite petite and easy to lose, but they're made small on purpose since you need things to be small if you're constantly on the go and carrying them in a bag. Plus, there's just so much functionality in these little things. It's essentially a combination of all the controllers Nintendo has ever created. It has the A, B, X, and Y buttons from the SNES, a single Joy-Con looks like an NES controller, and it has motion controls of the Wii. They even added a button to take quick screenshots in games, similar to the share button on the PS4's DualShock 4, but not quite as advanced. The Joy-Cons are chameleons and can adapt to pretty much any situation. You want to play a 2-player game? Just take one of the Joy-Cons out and hand it to your friend. You need motion controls? It's more than capable of doing so. You just want to play the game traditionally? Just keep the controllers together in their comfort grip or hold one in each hand. We've also seen more creative uses of the Joy-Cons in Nintendo Labo and Ring Fit Adventure. The Switch is capable of so much, and a lot of it has to do with its Joy-Con controllers. Even the Switch Pro controller is worth mentioning. It's more similar to a traditional controller, but a lot heftier because it has a battery that could last for approximately 40 hours on a single charge. It has every single controller beat in that regard. Since it's wider than the Joy-Cons and their comfort grip, the Pro controller is very comfy to hold and great for playing more traditional games. And that's the evolution of Nintendo controllers. They've sure come a long way since the NES days. Personally, we're big fans of the GameCube controller. But what do you think is the best Nintendo controller of all time? Let us know in the comments section down below, and don't forget to subscribe to The Gamer for more gaming videos. Thanks for watching.